My daughter was standing in the middle of the gallery on a Thursday afternoon in March, talking to a man in a gray suit who had the careful posture of someone managing a significant transaction, and she did not see me come through the door. I stopped, just inside the entrance. I looked at the walls. Eleanor's paintings were hung in 2 rows along the north and west walls of the gallery, 14 pieces, the largest collection of her work ever displayed in a single space. The light was good. The framing was exceptional. The wall text beside each piece was accurate in its dates and respectful in its description of Eleanor's technique and her development as an artist over the 30 years she had spent painting. I knew the wall text was accurate because I had written the foundational documentation it was drawn from. I had spent 6 months after Eleanor's death creating a comprehensive archive of her work, cataloging every piece, documenting the provenance of each, establishing the historical record that serious collectors and institutions require before acquiring significant work. I had done this because Eleanor had not done it herself, because artists rarely do, and because I had spent 35 years in publishing and I understood better than most people what happens to a body of work when the person who created it is gone and there is no one left who knows what it is. The man in the gray suit was showing Misha a document. She was reading it with the focused attention of someone reviewing terms she had already negotiated and is checking one final time before signing. I recognized the logo on the document from where I was standing. Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a company I had researched 3 months earlier when I had first understood the direction this was going. I walked to the nearest painting, a medium canvas from Eleanor's Coastal series, painted in the last good year before she got sick. The year we had rented the house in Maine and she had painted every morning for 3 weeks while I worked on manuscripts at the kitchen table. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I turned around and walked back out through the gallery door. I sat in my car in the parking structure across the street. I called my attorney. I said, "It's happening today." She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "I have been ready for 3 months." This is the story of what happens when a daughter forgets that her father spent 35 years in a business where the rights to a thing and the thing itself are never the pot. Same. My name is Jack Cole. I am 71 years old. I was born in Portland, Oregon, the son of a high school English teacher who believed with the particular conviction of someone who has spent their life around books that the most important thing a person could do was put something true and lasting into the world, and that the most important thing a publisher could do was make sure that something survived. I studied literature at Reed College, spent 2 years working for a large commercial publisher in New York, where I learned the economics of the business without falling in love with the economics, and returned to Portland in 1988 to found Cole Press with a converted basement office, a used typesetting system, and a list of 6 authors whose work I believed deserved more careful attention than the commercial market was inclined to give it. Cole Press grew slowly, and with the particular integrity of a small press that has decided early what it will and will not publish. We published literary fiction, narrative nonfiction, and the occasional collection of visual art documentation. We were never large. We were respected in the ways that matter in the literary world, which is to say our books were reviewed seriously and the rights we managed were managed with precision. I sold Cole Press 4 years ago to a literary foundation in Portland. I structured the sale carefully, retaining certain rights that mattered to me. The sale was clean. What I retained, among other things, was a comprehensive understanding of copyright law as it applies to visual art, which is to say the specific knowledge that the physical ownership of a painting and the intellectual property rights to that painting are 2 entirely separate things that can be owned by entirely different people, and that most people, including most people who buy and sell paintings, do not fully understand this. Eleanor passed 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Found late. Taking everything in 14 months. She was 67 years old and we had been married for 43 years and she had been painting seriously for 30 of them. building a body of work that was respected in the Pacific Northwest art community and that had been moving, in the years before she got sick, toward the wider recognition that serious artists sometimes reach in the last decade of their careers. After Eleanor passed, I did two things that Misha did not know about. The first was the archive. 6 months of documentation, every piece cataloged and photographed and described, the provenance of each work established, the exhibition history recorded, the sales history documented where it existed. A comprehensive record of Eleanor's life as an artist. The second was the copyright registration. Eleanor had never formally registered the copyright to her paintings. Most visual artists do not. The copyright exists automatically under U.S. law at the moment of creation, but formal registration with the Copyright Office creates a documented record and provides additional legal protections that matter enormously when commercial use is involved. I registered the copyright to every painting in Eleanor's body of work in the 6 months following her death, naming me as the rights holder, as her heir. I told no one, not Misha, not my son David, not anyone. I did it because 35 years of publishing had made proper rights management a reflex. 8 months after Eleanor's passing, Misha inherited the physical paintings. The will divided Eleanor's estate between Misha and David, with the physical artworks going to Misha because she had always been the child more connected to Eleanor's work, who had grown up watching her mother paint, who had the emotional relationship with the pieces that made her the appropriate custodian. Misha received the paintings. She did not receive the copyright. The copyright was never part of Eleanor's estate because I had registered it in my name before the estate was settled. Misha did not know this. I had not told her. I should have. I did not anticipate that it would become relevant in the way it became relevant. Misha is my daughter. She is 40 years old, and she has, for most of her adult life, been the child who is easiest to be around and hardest to predict, which is a combination that reflects both Eleanor's artistic temperament and my own tendency to think several steps further ahead than the immediate situation. She has Eleanor's eye and my vocabulary and a quality of determination that has served her well in her work as a gallery curator and that has occasionally run ahead of her judgment. She and Luis have been married for 7. Luis is 43 years old and works in commercial real estate development. He is good at identifying the commercial value of things and finding ways to realize that value efficiently. He has been a present husband to Misha and a respectful son-in-law, and I had no specific reason to distrust him until 5 months ago when I began to understand what they were planning. The plan had originated, I believe, with Luis. The specific mechanism, the engagement with Meridian through a commercial art licensing intermediary, had the structure of someone who works in commercial transactions and who looks at a collection of valuable paintings and asks not what they mean but what they can be used for. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had been developing a campaign for a new cardiac medication. The campaign concept, as I understood it from the research I had done, involved imagery associated with memory, time, loss, and continuity. Eleanor's coastal paintings, with their particular quality of light and their emotional resonance with themes of presence and absence, were exactly the kind of work a pharmaceutical company would want to associate with a medication marketed to older patients and their families. The licensing fee Meridian was prepared to pay for the right to use Eleanor's paintings in their campaign was, according to the document I had seen Misha reviewing in the gallery, $280,000. $280,000 for the commercial use of Eleanor's work in pharmaceutical advertising. Eleanor had spent 30 years painting. She had priced her work carefully and sold it to collectors who valued it for what it was. She had never licensed her work commercially. She had been asked twice and had declined twice, once by a hotel chain and once by a company that wanted to use her coastal series on a line of decorative products. She had said no both times because she had strong opinions about the contexts in which her work should appear, and pharmaceutical advertising was not a context she would have chosen. I knew this because she had told me. I knew it the way you know things that have been said directly and clearly by someone you have lived with for 43 years. Misha did not know this because Eleanor had not told her. Eleanor had not told her because the conversations about commercial licensing had happened before Misha was involved in the art world professionally, and because Eleanor had not anticipated that after her death, the question would arise in this form. I had known about the Meridian negotiation for 3 months. I had known because Louise had mentioned it at a family dinner in December with the offhand ease of someone who expects only enthusiasm and who had not noticed that I had become very still. The first sign had come 4 months before. The gallery. At a Sunday dinner in November, when Misha had mentioned that she was thinking about organizing a retrospective of Eleanor's work, I had said that sounded like a beautiful idea. She had said she was in conversation with a gallery in Portland about hosting it, and that there was also some interest from collectors in Los Angeles. I had said I was glad. Then Luis had said, as though it were the next natural point in the conversation, that there had also been some commercial inquiries about the work. He said a licensing agency had reached out about a pharmaceutical client that was interested in using some of the coastal pieces in an advertising campaign. I had looked at Luis across the table. I said, "What kind of advertising campaign?" He said it was for a cardiac medication, something about memory and continuity. He said the licensing fee being discussed was significant. I said, "Have you spoken with Margaret about the rights structure?" Luis said, "The gallery handles the licensing." "It's pretty standard," I said. "I'd be interested to understand the rights structure before anything moves forward." Misha said, "Dad, it's just commercial licensing. It happens all the time with estate work." I said, "I know it does. I spent 35 years in publishing. I understand licensing. I'd like to understand the specifics of this one before it proceeds." Luis said, "We'll loop you in." They did not loop me in. 2 weeks later, I called Margaret. My attorney's name was Margaret Park. She had handled the legal work for Cole Press for 18 years and had managed the sale of the press and had updated my estate documents after Eleanor's death. She was 59 and meticulous, and she had the specific knowledge of intellectual property law that comes from nearly 2 decades of working with a literary publisher. I told her about the Meridian inquiry. I told her about my copyright registrations. She said, "Jack, you registered all of the work?" I said, "Every piece in the catalog, all 211 paintings, in the 6 months after Eleanor passed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Misha doesn't know." I said, "No." She said, "Jack, without your authorization, any commercial licensing agreement Misha signs is unenforceable. The gallery can transfer the physical painting for display purposes, but commercial use rights belong to the copyright holder, which is you." I said, "I know." She said, "So the Meridian deal," I said, "cannot proceed without my signature." Margaret said, "Does Misha know this?" I said, "No. I need to understand the full shape of what she is doing before I decide how to address it." Margaret said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "Monitor. If a licensing agreement is filed or a transaction is recorded, I need to know immediately." She said, "And if the deal closes before you act?" I said, "It can't close. The commercial rights are mine. Any transaction without my authorization is void." Margaret said, "Jack, you need to tell Misha." I said, "I will, when I understand everything I need to understand." She said, "When will that be?" I said, "Soon." It took 3 months. On a Thursday afternoon in March, I walked through the door of the Harlow Gallery on Northwest 23rd Street, and I saw my daughter reviewing a $280,000 licensing agreement with a representative of Meridian. Pharmaceuticals, and I understood that soon had become now. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 22 minutes after I left the gallery. I called Margaret. I told her what I had seen. She said, "Has she signed?" I said, "She was reviewing the document when I walked in." She had not signed yet. Margaret said, "Jack, if she signs that agreement today, the gallery and Meridian will both have a problem because the agreement will be unenforceable. But Misha will also have a problem because she will have represented herself as having rights she does not have." I said, "I know." Margaret said, "You need to stop this before she signs." I said, "I know that too." I called Misha. She answered on the second ring. She sounded distracted, the way people sound when they are in the middle of something they want to finish. I said, "Misha, don't sign anything today." A silence. She said, "Dad?" I said, "I'm outside. I need you to come out and talk to me before you sign that document." Another silence. Longer. She said, "How do you know about the document?" I said, "I'll explain everything outside, but please don't sign it before we talk." She said, "Dad, this is a significant deal. We've been working on this for months." I said, "I know. Please come outside." She came out 5 minutes later. She was wearing the expression of someone who is managing two competing emotions: the irritation of being interrupted at a critical moment, and the unease of not knowing why her father is standing outside the gallery on a day he had no reason to be there. We stood on the sidewalk on Northwest 23rd. The afternoon light was good, the kind of light Eleanor would have noticed. I said, "Misha, I need to tell you something I should have told you 2 years ago when I settled Eleanor's estate." She said, "What?" I said, "The physical paintings belong to you. The copyright to Eleanor's work belongs to me. I registered it in the 6 months after she passed. Any commercial licensing of her work requires my authorization." She looked at me. She said, "What?" I said, "The Meridian agreement is unenforceable without my signature. If you sign it today, you will be representing yourself as having rights you do not legally hold." She said nothing for a long moment. The sidewalk was busy around us, people moving past with the purposeful unhurry of a Portland afternoon, and Misha stood very still in the middle of it. She said, "You registered the copyright?" I said, "Yes," she said, without telling me. I said, "Yes." She said, "For 2 years." I said, "Yes." She said, "Dad." I said, "I know, I should have told you. I am telling you now because you are about to sign an agreement that would put you in legal difficulty, and I am not willing to let that happen," she said. "Luis has been working on this deal for 3 months. I said, "I know." She said, "The gallery has a commission." I said, "I know that too." She was quiet. She looked at the gallery door. Then she looked at me. She said, "Would you have let me sign it?" I said, "No. I would not have let you sign it. That is why I am here," she said. "But you let it get this far." I said, "Yes, I did. That was my mistake, and I am sorry for it." We stood on the sidewalk for a while longer. Then she said, "I need to go back in and tell them we need to pause." I said, "I'll come with you." The gallery. The conversation inside the gallery was not easy, and I will not describe it in detail because the details belong to Misha and to the gallery and to the representative from Meridian who had driven up from San Francisco for a transaction that was not going to proceed as planned. What I will say is that I sat at the table in the gallery's back office and I placed Margaret's documentation of the copyright registrations on the table, and I explained, with the precision of someone who has spent 35 years managing intellectual property, exactly what the rights structure was and what it meant for the proposed agreement. The Meridian representative said, "This is a significant complication." I said, "It is a clarification. The underlying rights structure has always been what it is. The complication is that it was not communicated clearly before this point." He said, "Are you willing to authorize the licensing?" I said, "I need to think about that." He said, "The campaign timeline is..." I said, "I understand there is a timeline. I also need time to consider whether this use of my late wife's work is appropriate." He looked at Misha. Misha looked at her hands. I said, Eleanor declined 2 commercial licensing requests during her lifetime. I know this because she told me. I don't know whether she would have declined this one. I need time to think about it. We left the gallery at 4:15. Misha and I stood on the sidewalk again. She said, "Are you going to authorize it?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Luis has put a lot of work into this." I said, "I understand that." She said, $280,000, Dad. I said, "I know what it is, Misha." She said, "Mom's gone. The paintings are the only thing left of her work in the world. We should be able to decide what happens to them." I said, "The physical paintings are yours. What appears on them is Eleanor's. The question of what she would have wanted matters to me, even though she is not here to say." Misha was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Did she ever say anything to you about pharmaceutical advertising specifically?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What did she say?" I said, "She said no." I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. I called David, who is my son and Misha's brother, and who had inherited a portion of Eleanor's estate that did not include the paintings, but who had a perspective on his mother's wishes that I wanted to hear. David is 37 years old, and he has Eleanor's directness and my patience, and he said, without hesitation, that his mother would not have wanted her paintings in a pharmaceutical advertisement. He said it the way people say things they are certain of. I called 2 of Eleanor's closest friends from her painting community, women who had known her work for 20 years. Both said the same thing David had said. I called the curator at the Portland Museum of Art, where Eleanor had shown twice, and asked what she thought Eleanor's position would have been on commercial licensing of the Coastal series. The curator said Eleanor had been very clear that the Coastal paintings were personal and that she had strong feelings about the contexts in which they appeared. I called Margaret. I said, "I'm going to decline the Meridian licensing." Margaret said, "Jack, are you certain?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Misha will not be pleased." I said, "I know," she said. "Luis will be very not pleased." I said, "I know that too." Margaret drafted the formal declination letter to Meridian and to the gallery. It cited the copyright holder's determination that the proposed commercial use was inconsistent with the artist's documented approach to her work during her lifetime. It was polite, specific, and final. I called Misha before the letter went out. She answered on the 3rd ring. When I told her she was quiet for a long time, she said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "You're really not going to authorize it?" I said, "No." She said, $280,000. I said, "Misha, your mother spent 30 years building a body of work with specific intentions about what it meant and how it should be seen. I am not willing to put it in a pharmaceutical advertisement that she would have declined herself." She said, "You don't know that for certain." I said, "I know it as well as I know anything." She said, "That's not the same as knowing." I said, "No, it isn't, but it is what I have." She was quiet again. I waited. She said, "What happens to the paintings then? They just hang on our walls?" I said, "They can be shown in galleries. They can be sold to collectors who want to own them. They can be loaned to museums. Eleanor's work can be seen and appreciated for what it is. What it cannot be is a prop in an advertisement for cardiac medication." She said, "Luis is going to be very upset." I said, "I imagine so." She said, "Dad, I have to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why didn't you tell me about the copyright when Mom died?" I was quiet for a moment. I said, "Because I didn't think it would matter in the way it mattered. I did it to protect Eleanor's work, not to create a complication for you. I should have told you immediately. Not telling you was a failure of communication that I take full responsibility for." She said, "If you had told me, I would have known to talk to you before the Meridian thing got this far." I said, "Yes, you would have. I'm sorry." A long silence. She said, "The retrospective is still happening. I said, I know. I think it's going to be beautiful. She said, will you write the introduction for the catalog? I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, yes, I would like that very much. Luis called me 2 days after the letter went out. The conversation was brief and not particularly warm. He said he felt the decision was being made on sentimental rather than practical grounds. I said he was correct that sentiment was involved and that I considered this appropriate given the circumstances. He said $280,000 was a significant sum to decline on principle. I said I had spent 35 years in publishing making decisions on principle and that I intended to continue doing so. He did not call again. The retrospective opened 6 weeks later at the Harlow Gallery. 14 paintings on the north and west walls, the same arrangement I had seen on a Thursday afternoon in March. The framing was exceptional. The light was good. The introduction to the catalog was 4 pages. I had written it over 3 evenings at the kitchen table where Eleanor used to sit across from me while I worked on manuscripts, and she worked on composition sketches in her spiral notebooks. I wrote about the Coastal series and what it had meant to Eleanor and what it meant to me and what I believed it meant to anyone willing to look at it carefully. Misha told me afterward that 3 people had cried reading it at the opening. I am 71 years old. I spent 35 years in a business where the most important distinction in any transaction is the distinction between the thing and the rights to the thing. A manuscript and the copyright to a manuscript. A recording and the master rights. A painting and the intellectual property in the painting. These are not the same thing. They are never the same thing. And the failure to understand the difference is the source of more damage, financial and otherwise, than almost any other misunderstanding in the creative industries. Misha understood that the paintings were hers. She did not understand that the right to use them commercially was mine. That misunderstanding came from my failure to communicate, not from any bad intention on her part. The Meridian deal was a mistake born of incomplete information, not of malice. Luis saw an opportunity and moved toward it with the efficiency that his professional experience produces. I do not blame him for that. I blame myself for allowing the situation to develop to the point where stopping it required the kind of disruption it required. What I want to say about the copyright decision, about the declination of $280,000, is this. The money was real. The principle was also real. Eleanor spent 30 years building a body of work with specific intentions and specific values about what it was and what it was for. She is not here to defend those intentions. I am. That is not a burden. It is the last and most important thing I can do for the work she made. The coastal paintings are still being shown. 3 pieces from the retrospective were acquired by collectors in the months that followed, at prices that reflected the work's actual value rather than its utility as advertising imagery. The Museum of Art has expressed interest in a permanent acquisition of 2 pieces from the series. Eleanor's work is being seen. It is being seen as what it is. Misha and I had dinner last month. The conversation was easy in the way that things become easy after the difficult part has been said and heard and absorbed. She asked me to help her think about the long-term stewardship of the collection, and I said I would be glad to. I brought the copyright registration documents to dinner. I gave her a copy of everything. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, these are incredibly thorough." I said, "I had a good model. Your mother kept impeccable records of her work." She smiled. She has Eleanor's smile, the specific quality of it, and for a moment the kitchen was very full. Tell me in the comments, has someone you loved left something behind that you felt a responsibility to protect? I want to hear from you.